What led you to become a composer?
I often ask myself the same question. It began when I was at school, and of course, like all young musicians, I'd been playing for many years, playing keyboard, realising that I was never going to be a performer. But I got interested in writing music because my music teacher at school started to expose me to modern compositions. First of all Debussy, but then Schoenberg, and particularly Alban Berg. I remember him putting on at that time an old 78 of the Berg violin concerto, and it knocked me for 6. And I started writing pieces, and I think at that stage pretending that I was being a composer. And then I went to university and found out the hard lesson of what it was to begin on the road of being a professional composer, and I took some very hard knocks along the way. And one of the first knocks was when I did a string quartet at the end of my first year as a student, and it was dismissed as rubbish. And I could at that point have given up. And I became very determined that I was going to succeed. And I worked at it for many years and eventually got the idea of what I ought to be doing, and the music started to sound like music, and it went on from there.
Is it like sort of being a singer? Is it a question of finding your voice early on?
It's a way of finding, I suppose, a way of making sense of the notes and making shapes and patterns and rhythmic shapes, and also colours, which are terribly important to me, that begin to chime with something that you feel that you want to do internally. And just as I was beginning to compose music, I also became very interested in painting. And there was a point when I wanted to actually go to art college and give up music altogether, because everyone expected me to go into music, and I thought the great thing to do would be not to do that and to go into painting. And so I found I was working with two disciplines in parallel in mind, one working in the visual medium with colours and textures and shapes and composing things within a frame, and then trying to do the same in music, composing things within a frame, and not being nearly as successful in music as I was in the paintings. But the music started to get stronger, and that's when that began to take over. And then I suppose I was about 20, 21, so I was really quite a late developer in terms of composition.
When you start a piece, how do you start? Do you start from an idea? I mean, are you inspired by things? You say you're very visually orientated. Do you start from that standpoint, or do you start from sounds?
Well, it has to start from sounds. If it doesn't start from sounds, I think you're lost. But it's what prompts those sounds. And for me, it can be the visual things, the stimulation of the visual impact of a landscape, for example. It has been paintings. My first big orchestral piece was inspired by the paintings of a 19th century French symbolist painter called Gustave Moreau. Mm-hmm. And I've been inspired by Gauguin. It's interesting that a lot of the things I'm inspired by are French.
Right.
And I think that there is a lot of the music I love is French, and I think there is a French tinge to a lot of the things I do. But at the same time, I think I'm also very, very stimulated by literature, particularly by poetry, by words. You know, a word, I can see a word written down, or a phrase or a line in a poem, and it has a resonance, and I can sometimes identify in that resonance something that will allow me to find a sound equivalent, whether it's to do with the sky or the sea or the fells of the landscape where I live in Northumberland. Something resonates, and I find that I have this deep need to find a musical equivalent for that. But sometimes pieces begin simply as sounds. Mm-hmm. And then, as I'm beginning to develop the piece, and this has happened with the Oboe-Concerto, I find something purely by chance, by accident, and I have no idea how this happens, and it's happened to me a number of times in my compositions. For example, I was working on material for the Oboe-Concerto when I suddenly went to my bookshelves and I pulled off a volume of poems by Guillaume Apollinaire. a French surrealist poet. And I opened it, and there was a poem called Un oiseau chante, a bird sings. And it's all about a man hearing a bird singing, but in a landscape which is so alien that it's shocking, and you don't realise it immediately when you start to read the poem. And what's shocking is that the man is hearing the bird singing, but the man is in the First World War trenches, and he's surrounded by the crackle of rifle fire and the bombardments and the terrible situation. And so you've got the beauty of this thing on the one hand and the very, very plaintive idea. And I thought, this is so like what I'm doing in the piece already. And at that point, the poem started to take over, in a sense, and control even more the atmosphere of what was already happening in the piece. And I decided to call the piece Apollinaire's Bird.